Hello, everyone. I'm so thrilled to introduce Katherine Stewart, an investigative journalist and best-selling author who has become one of the leading voices on the rise of religious nationalism in America. Her book, her books include The Power Worshippers, which inspired the documentary God and Country. Her newest book, of course, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, and more. Catherine's reporting, featured in the New York Times and many other outlets, examines how big money donors, propaganda, and religious extremism are fueling authoritarianism in the United States. Today, she'll share insight from her latest book, and will talk to us a little bit more about the powers at play here. And yeah, so we're lucky to have her. And please join me in welcoming Katherine Stewart.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. I want to thank all of you joining here today. Really feel very lucky to be here with you. It's so important for students to understand what's happening, to be engaged. And I thought, there's a lot to talk about right now. It's a sort of fire hose of corruption and disinformation and anti-democratic moves. But I thought for this talk, I would like to focus on the war on higher education and the war on science and how these two features of the anti-democratic movement are really critical to its modes of operation. In the time since the Trump administration has taken power, it has gutted the scientific research apparatus that has grounded America's economic strength and made us the envy of the world. It has destroyed agencies that handle food and drug safety and approve new medications. It has fired people who handle nuclear codes and air traffic and slashed funds for scientific research at America's top universities and at state universities, all the way down. And of course, while it claims to be cost cutting, alleging that there's no more money left to fund children's cancer research and things like that, the Trump family is engaging in absolutely epic and unprecedented forms of financial corruption, enriching themselves to the tune of billions of dollars through grifty meme coin schemes, social media platform schemes, and they're trading blatantly off the office of the presidency to personally enrich themselves and their political allies. To most of us, this apparent war on science and war on education is baffling. Again, scientific advancement has been a feature of American greatness. It has made us the envy of the world. It's been a huge generator of jobs and wealth. And in fact, a subset of the ultra wealthy funders who are bankrolling this authoritarian power grab actually made their money in large measure thanks to scientific innovations and technological innovations, often directly or indirectly, which were government funded through government funded science studies and research. So, what's the reason for this wholesale attack? It just doesn't seem to make any sense unless you consider that the war on science is part of a battle for control of higher education. Consider that most scientific research is carried out at universities, and government research grants are the first things that get cut when the Trump administration is looking for blackmail opportunities. So the war on science is, in some sense, collateral damage from battle for control of institutions of higher learning. But there's a deeper reason. The movement identifies the scientific system as detrimental to its political goals because science depends on facts. Science depends on reason and careful processes. Facts and reason are inimical to dictatorial power, right? So, quite simply, this movement, this anti-democratic movement, and its leaders know that truth is their enemy. This anti-rationalist ideology comes in several flavors, not all of them consistent. One wing comes out of the evangelical hard right, which has long argued that science has been turned into a weapon against faith. A large subset of the Christian nationalist movement, for example, claims that climate science is not merely a hoax, but a secular plot to undermine religion. They actually sometimes call it a false theology. They refer to climate science as a green dragon, right? It's satanic, demonic. Then there's a different approach emerging from people in the orbit of these far right think tanks that I highlight in my newest book, Money, Lies, and God. These are think tanks such as the Claremont Institute and the Heritage Foundation, which is the organization that coordinated Project 2025. I'm sure a lot of you listening in know exactly what that is. It was a sort of blueprint for the current Trump administration, coordinated by Heritage, but with the input of over 100 far right and right wing think tanks. So these folks in this sort of side of the anti science equation hold the view that science has become part of what they call a woke bureaucracy, whatever that means. They think that science is intent on pushing undesirable social views and cutting off opportunities for a genuine and dictatorial leader of the people. The folks in this orbit say that we need a red Caesar, right? A dictatorial leader, a Cyrus type leader who can enact his will without facts and reason getting in the way. They see in science an evil bureaucracy, and they simply want to destroy it. So there's a third, and I would say numerically smaller, but extremely influential group in this anti science war on education cohort. It includes the, I would say, tech leader allies. People call them tech bros, but like it's only a subset of them. And they're the allies of the authoritarian movement. Some of them believe that AI and other allegedly private sector forces were to soon dominate science. Therefore, we don't need traditional government funding for science. We don't need that system anymore. They want to put us, they want to put themselves in charge instead with their AI, and they want us, the rest of us, to put our blind faith behind them, the tech overlords, who they think are the absolute best at everything they do and deserve all of their wealth and their, dozens of houses and some of them actually have baby farms. You can't make this stuff up. And say, think about Musk, and there's a few others where they're just won't go there right now, but they think that they can be counted on. These wonderful tech overlords, they can be counted on to pursue science on behalf of all of humanity, or at least on behalf of their own ballooning fortunes. So I want to focus for a minute on the war against higher ed and K through 12, kindergarten through the 12th grade. Did you guys hear that the Trump administration has recently directed the Department of Education to elevate conservative Christianity to essentially an official religion of our public schools? They've been doing this through a number of means for several decades, but it's all happening in the current administration. See, public schools have been flashpoints for the culture wars for decades. I started researching this movement 16 years ago. My first book in this field was titled The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. It was about that war on public education. And back then, when I started researching that war on education, which is the one small part of the larger war on American democracy, it was clear this movement was deeply hostile to the institution of public education, precisely because public schools are meant to be non-sectarian. They're meant to be welcoming of all families, regardless of their religious or political backgrounds. They're not supposed to affirm nor denigrate any particular religious viewpoint. But these folks didn't like that at all. I mean, Jerry Falwell made the agenda clear. In 1979, he said, "I hope to see the day when there are no more public schools. Churches will have taken them over and Christians will be running them." Other powerful religious right leaders at the time, like D. James Kennedy, whose ministry received, by the way, millions of dollars from the family of Trump's former education secretary, Betsy DeVos. So this guy Kennedy, D. James Kennedy, said schools were atheistic and amoral and were brainwashing children in, quote, godless secularism. They weren't. In fact, they were just religiously neutral, neither affirming nor denigrating any religion. But this is a movement that sees they see equality as hostile. They view the principle of equality with hostility. They don't believe there's neutrality. They think if you're neutral, then we're being oppressed, even though they're just getting the same treatment as everybody else. But that's how they see it. They've sort of cultivated, movement leaders have cultivated that sense of grievance and hurled that grievance against their political enemies. So the destruction of public education has been a longstanding aim. But when I published a book on that topic in 2012, the religious right activists and eventually those who wanted to privatize public schools, and these two groups were working hand in hand. They were starting to work hand in hand, but they were kind of discreet about their alliance. Only a few people at the margins were out there admitting that the end game was to starve what they consider the beast of public education and redirect that flow of taxpayer cash to religious and private or ideologically right-wing schools. Today, they're really upfront about that. The goal is to create a national network of publicly financed religious schools that explicitly favor forms of conservative and reactionary forms of religion. So superficially, it looks like they're trying to achieve the same by forcing their initiatives and programming into the public schools, and they're succeeding to some extent. That's the motivation of the Ten Commandments laws that mandate, I'm sure some of you went to these schools, they mandate that 10 commandments are displayed in every public school classroom, or this law in Texas that offers to pay schools to teach elementary age kids a sectarian reactionary Christian curricula, or Louisiana and Oklahoma rules that impose the Bible in schools. But the expansion of voucher initiatives, where a portion of taxpayer dollars is diverted to these vouchers that parents can use to send their kids to religious schools, that's just the start. The movement and its right-wing legal apparatus is really aiming at publicly funded charter schools that are explicitly religious, and it's also aiming to force more and more religious initiatives into the public schools. And that's what the Trump administration has been really explicit about doing this week. Meanwhile, they're undermining public education at every turn. They're igniting needless conflicts and panics over critical race theory, which is, by the way, not taught in public schools. And what they want to do is foster mistrust in public schools and pave the way for privatization. So sometimes they'll find some little thing that's happening in one corner of the universe. You can always find, forgive me if there's anybody here from Florida, but there's always a Florida man somewhere. They'll find something and then they'll amplify it and tell their people it's happening absolutely everywhere in order to foster this panic. And the result of that is they're banning books in public school libraries like The Diary of a Young Girl, which is the Diary of Anne Frank, any any books that have to do with anti-bullying, accepting people who are of diverse backgrounds or sexual orientations or things like that. So the division and conflict that these types of book bans and other initiatives promote in diverse school communities, it's not an unintended consequence of their activity. It's really the point. The desired end, of course, is where people flee the public schools because they get fed up with them, they get fed up with the drama, and they then, it softens the ground for the taxpayers saying, yeah, I want some public money so I can send the kids to the school of my choice, or forcing these, in many instances, unpopular voucher initiatives through ballot measures and through other means. So this kind of drama that's happening in public schools, and by the way, also in universities, it's a twofer. It promises to be very profitable for the religiously motivated entrepreneurs involved, and at the same time, it's intended to build a constituency for right-wing Christian nationalist politics. Now, this brings me to where we are now. Trump and the new right and Christian nationalist movement that stands behind Trump want to destroy any institution that they can control. Gaining institutions of higher, gaining control of the institutions of higher education is really part of any authoritarian project. It happens in other authoritarian countries, but it also shows the extent to which the new right and Project 2025 radicals are driving the bus. They've long said the only way for the right to win, for their movement to win, is to smash what they call the administrative state, the institutions of a functioning government, but also seize control of the cultural institutions like universities and museums that they say have been conquered and colonized by, quote, a woke elite. By woke, obviously, they mean people who believe in equality. These folks who oppose democracy said well before the election that they think it's better to destroy those universities and rebuild from the ground up on the wreckage so that they can have cultural institutions aligned with their reactionary agenda. They're literally trying to rewrite history and write out parts of our history that make them feel uncomfortable. We're seeing the application of this mindset where they declare that we're in an emergency, and that sort of justifies pretty much everything, right? Starting with the destruction of education, the destruction of science. And ultimately, they say you're with the people, the folk, you're one of us, or you're an enemy, you're one of them. It's insider or outsider. The left is often accused of playing identity politics. Sometimes I think that's true, but the right plays them much, much harder. You know, at the right-wing conferences I go to, the right-wing strategy gatherings that I go to in the course of my research, anyone who's not on board with MAGA, which by the way includes a lot of what they call rhinos or Republicans in name only, are called demonic or satanic, or referred to in the most dehumanizing kinds of terms. So this is why they are trying to destroy the universities. They tell their people, the rank and file, that elites are running the universities and they're the enemy, so they need to be destroyed. So they're working on this anti-elitist rhetoric, but they themselves want to be a new elite. And I would have to say today, with respect to the universities, there are times when they do it by cynically deploying a false narrative of anti-Semitism. In order for this to play with a Fox News crowd, they'll ham up accusations of anti-Semitism. And while some amount of anti-Semitism certainly exists, along with other forms of bigotry in any campus or institution, this is largely an overstatement and an excuse for wholesale attack and destruction on education and for them seizing control in ways that are frankly unconstitutional. So, where do we stand now and what is to be done? I think this is the most important part of the discussion because anyone who's really paying attention knows that we're in rough shape right now. The democracy is at risk. So the question is, what can be done? Well, I think first we need to say that, listen, most Republicans, not all, but most Republicans are still standing by Trump. I think the latest polls say something like 70 to 80%, 78 to 80%. But independents have shifted dramatically away from support for Trump. He has under 30% approval from independents. And that is huge. It's I wouldn't not sure if it's unprecedented, but it's massive. And while he did get a bump in support from young people and others who perhaps believed his promise to lower the price of eggs and resolve foreign wars at the snap of his fingers, et cetera, it doesn't take more than a trip to the grocery store or a look at the international news pages, look at the reports of job losses in his tenure to see that as long as MAGA stays in power, all they will do is shift ever more money to the top 0.1% of our country and hollow out things for everyone else, further impoverish the middle and working classes, further work to the destruction of unions. They're not going to solve the housing crisis. These needless tariffs are raising the cost of goods for everybody. And I think a lot of people are really seeing that as well, that a lot of his promises were incredibly hollow. So there are a lot of reasons to feel hope, right? The key is to get everyone to vote. We need to turn out the base of voters and go after low propensity voters and independents. Every vote matters, and it's critical to help people understand that. We need to build a pro-democracy coalition. Earlier today, I was actually with a group of folks in this town who get together for 2 hours every Tuesday to do some kind of pro-democracy action. Sometimes it's writing postcards to people not out of state, in state, to alert them to, propositions that are coming up that MAGA types are supporting and that should be defeated. Uh, there's a proposition here in California right now, Proposition 50, which is a response to Republican efforts to do extreme gerrymandering in Texas, which they're doing because they're worried that they will no longer form a dominant coalition. So they're doing this weird gerrymandering in the state to elevate and privilege right-wing votes. And so the response in California is to say, you know what, if you're going to do it, we're going to do it too. And now there's the son of a billionaire, a guy named Charles Munger Jr., who's funding a huge ballot measure to defeat the California response. I mean, this is maybe a little bit insider baseball-y for you guys, but the fact is that this group is getting involved in democracy building on a level that is local, effective, and engages in multiple forms of action. And there are several dozen people in this group, and every single one of us can take an action. It all just started, it wasn't a Democratic Party initiative. It was actually just a woman who was like, I need to do something. I'm going to get some of my friends together, and we're going to not just hold one another accountable to vote, but we're going to try and get out the vote, not just in national election cycles, but in local elections, in midterms. You guys, we've got midterms coming up, pretty soon. I think just a little more than a year, is it? And maybe less. It's like everybody can get involved in this. And the midterms are really critical because if we can take back, those who believe in democracy can take back some power in the House and the Senate, can block the worst of MAGA's initiatives, and then hopefully set the stage for taking some power back and seeing a shift in power in 2028. So I would say there's one big mistake that the anti-MAGA world has made. And it is the same mistake that opponents of fascism in the early 20th century made, which is they failed to unify. They failed to recognize that their genuine enemy was not the person immediately to their left or immediately to their right, but it was the person who was trying to tear down a democratic system altogether and replace it with strongman politics. So I think it's really important to have a big tent, to understand that we're not all going to agree on everything. To paraphrase a former president, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. And I think we would do well to heed that advice. Those who oppose authoritarianism are a big, noisy coalition. It's like a family with 8 kids. Is everybody going to get everything they want? No. But if they can sort of work together to kind of benefit the common good, then they can actually get some stuff done. If we're lucky or organized enough to overcome this tendency that we often have to sort of, infight, I would say the first thing is really we need to mobilize enough voters to shift course. There's no substitute for voter turnout. So everybody should, work to bring people into their circle. The second is that we need, again, that big tent we need. And the third is that the oldest trick in the book is to divide and conquer. We need to get smarter about recognizing when supporters of autocracy, whether they're part of the MAGA coalition or whether they're people in Russia, in Russian bot farms, who are funneling divisive messages into our social media feeds, we need to get a little smarter about recognizing that. They're weaponizing certain issues in order to divide us, or as soon as somebody seems to rise their profile, who might have a chance of actually achieving something, all of a sudden they might pile on that person or nitpick. So we need to be adept at avoiding some of the traps they're setting for us and turn the spotlight back on the epic forms of corruption and failure that this administration is engaging in. And finally, I want to say that people have a lot of resentments, and some of the resentments are legitimate. We've seen a massive upward concentration of wealth over the past decades to the top 0.1%. It's not even the top 0.1%, it's 0.1, and it's sort of thinning out, hollowing out of the middle and working classes, making housing unaffordable for people. The job situation is not where it should be. And a lot of these have to do with long-term structural problems. So if we do manage to gain enough political power back, we need to prepare for these deep structural reforms that address the needs of Americans and revive democracy in the face of a threat that is frankly going to outlive its present incarnation. I include a lot of more specific recommendations in my book, the final section of Money, Lies, and God, inside the movement to destroy American democracy. So I do hope you'll pick up a copy, and I'd really love to hear from you today. So thank you so much for listening. So I think what I'm going to do is look in the Q&A because I see there's some nice questions here. And I'm going to, I'm looking at some stuff. Oh, Ray, yeah, talking about PragerU for educational materials. It would be great for if you guys could use the chat for chat and Q&A for Q&A so I can answer some questions. But I just want to speak to that first thing I'm seeing in the Q&A, which is Prager University is being used in public schools. Prager University is not a university. It's funded by the Wilkes brothers, who are these Texas fracking billionaires who are incredibly fundamentalist. And it's basically a far right information operation, propaganda outfit that has posted videos that talk about the benefits of slavery. And they just sometimes use a David Barton type history and substitute that for real history. It's just propaganda. And the fact that it's being pushed in any public school is atrocious. So here's a question from Lawrence. The Christian nationalists are very organized and well funded. Can we compete? Where are our big money donors and think tanks? Thank you, Lawrence. There are some big money donors, there are some think tanks, and there are a lot of democracy building initiatives coming up. They're not as, I would say, they don't have quite the same sort of infrastructure. Like the Christian nationalist movement is a very deeply networked organizational infrastructure. It has a right-wing policy sphere. It has legal advocacy sphere. It has networking groups. It's, been built up very consciously and carefully over decades. Those who are sort of not on that side, so on this pro-democracy side, there are a lot of great organizations out there. Sometimes they don't spend the money as they're not as well funded. Let's just face it. The funding isn't the same. And I'd love to see more funders who believe in democracy step up and start putting money into organizational infrastructure building instead of putting money into, say, an individual politician's coffers, which is, sometimes great, but sometimes if they don't need the money, and sometimes they also, if they lose their election, then the money goes away. Whereas if you put money into an organization that supports different policy initiatives and sustains politicians who sort of agree with them. Even if that politician loses their election, the money is still there and can keep working toward these aims. Um, so it's not like there's nothing. It's just not the same. One thing that the right has that those on the other side, frankly, do not have is a faith-based component that is a really critical component to the anti-democratic movement. It's incredibly well funded. There are these initiatives like Faith Wins and Watchmen on the Wall. And what they do is they draw, Church United, they draw all these conservative and conservative leaning pastors into networks. And the movement leaders give presentations to these pastors and tell them it's your biblical duty to turn out your congregations to vote. And they give them tools that leave absolutely no doubt about who people are supposed to vote for. And then they also, give them voter turnout materials and tools and data tools, videos to air at church, voter guides, things like that. There's nothing that exists like that on the progressive religious side of the aisle. There are some smaller initiatives. There is, of course, Souls to the Polls, which helps in some places, but it's not, I would say, as rich or as it's powerful, but it doesn't have the money that the other side has. It's not quite the same. But there are a lot of progressive pastors who are very deeply concerned about what's happening to our country, to our democracy, and they are very upset about what they see as the subversion of their faith. Um, and, I think many of them are reluctant to jump into the fray of politics, but the other side is doing it. So that's just something to consider. Thank you so much for the question. So Jane says, to what extent do you think that people don't appreciate democracy? They can't distinguish it from, they see failures over time. I think it's clear that we have had failures over time in our system. We've had, I'm not going to both sides this. I think there's one party that is on the side of sustaining unions, sustaining rights for the workforce, supporting a higher minimum wage, supporting the fighting of corruption in the C-suites. And there's another party that has been unabashedly on the side of a more libertarian interpretation of economics that has wanted what they say, capitalism is always great, it's always the best. It's not Democrats who are saying this is like, but they, at the same time, a lot of think about some of the pro-Trump allies, they want privileged contracts for themselves. They want taxpayer subsidies for their initiatives. Think about Elon Musk, right? He says, oh, the markets, let them do their thing, American innovation, blah, blah, blah. And then at the same time, he's taking billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies and he's getting billions in privileged contracts from the government. He's getting everything he wants with his alliance with Trump. So, but I think there are, speaks to what I was talking about earlier. Listen, I put the word money first in the title of my book, Money Lies in God, because over decades we've seen this massive concentration of wealth at the upward, and it's hollowing out life for those who are not for the bottom 90%, 90 plus percent of Americans who aren't the beneficiaries of that sort of upward concentrations of wealth. And that creates resentments. I think you have a lot of folks who say, well, my parents could afford to buy a house and we could sustain the family on a single income while the kids were little and things just seemed affordable and, summer camp was no problem. And all of a sudden, young families today are like, you've got two parents and you got four jobs and they still can't seem to make ends meet or have a decent standard of living. And the right is really good at harnessing those resentments and hurling them at their political enemies. So I think on the one hand, I'm not going to both sides thing, but as I discuss in Money Lies in God, I think should we gain political power back, we really need to address some of the structural economic inequalities that we've been seeing. and make life fairer, especially for young people who really deserve a chance at making beautiful lives for themselves. So, Jane, thank you so much for the question. Let's see. Juliet, what do you think is the most important issue for student leaders to focus on within public schools? I mean, there are so many issues today. The most important, I think a really important issue, I mean, there are so many important issues. One thing is the preservation of public education itself. This is a movement that really wants to destroy public education. And when we look at places where public education has been hollowed out and replaced with charters, unaccountable charters, there's some good charter schools, don't get me wrong, but in states like Arizona with unaccountable charters, no oversight, you have massive corruption. Like there's this one guy who started a 4 or 5 charter network, sold it to some of his buddies, and pocketed $12 million of taxpayer money just for himself for starting this charter. There's other places where public schools have been replaced with charters, and what happens with these charters is a lot of them, first of all, they aren't always neighborhood schools, so they can't offer wraparound services in the way that public schools can for the communities that need them. And then sometimes they'll just, oh, well, things aren't going well, so we're just going to shutter the school. Well, where does that leave the kids? Where does that leave those families? So there's a lot of corruption in the charter sector. And then, of course, the right, sort of radical right, has been trying to sort of use charters as a wedge to destroy public schools and to send packed taxpayer money to faith schools or to reactionary religious schools that are free to teach contempt for people of other faiths, free to teach, creationism, whatever they want. So I think helping people understand why the defense of public education matters is important. Now, do public schools need to be improved? Of course, some of them do. Some of them are great, some of them are less great, but you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. So that's really important. I would say that the separation of church and state is really critical for the preservation of public education because public schools are supposed to be welcoming of all students. I mean, we sent our kids to public schools, and that was one of the best things about our public schools. They teach kids how to get along with those who are different, right? Kids from different backgrounds, kids from different religions, or even different political orientations. They make their friends. And in doing so, they develop faith in their, common future. And they learn how to work with people who are maybe a little different from them, but they learn how to get along with others. And this idea of pluralism and peace within pluralism is really sort of upsetting to those on the religious right. So preserving the separation of, non-sectarian education is really super important. Thank you so much. Um, okay, so you're asking about well-known atheists. I don't know who you're talking about, so I'm sorry I'm going to skip over that question because it seems a little general. Um, the regime seems to use the shadow docket a lot. Is this not available to anyone else? I don't hear much about activity around anti-MAGA requests. There's been a tremendous opposition to this agenda in the courts. And right now, Supreme Court, as we know, has been captured by the far right, in part through the right-wing legal ecosystem, which is funded to the tune of billions of dollars and includes organizations like the Federalist Society, which has played a huge role in promoting and funding right-wing legal talent, right? The Alliance Defending Freedom, First Liberty, Beckett, Pacific Justice Institute, all of these right-wing legal advocacy organizations have played a huge role in getting us to where we are today. But the lower courts are really standing in opposition to a lot of this agenda. And the Trump administration is losing in those lower courts over and over and over again. Right now, Supreme Court in its current make is really not a friend to democracy. They shamefully declared that anything Trump could do in his office as presidency could not be prosecutable, anything at all. So that seems like just incredibly unconstitutional. They've made a number of unconstitutional moves, but lower courts seem to be standing in opposition. So I hope that answers your question. There are just a lot of forms of legal opposition that we're seeing today that may not make the headlines all the time, but that do make a difference. Nancy, how do we prevent infighting in our ranks? The right does it. I mean, there's infighting on the right too, but I'm always hearing them say there's no victory without unity. So they do find a way to work together. And if they can do it, we can do it, right? Um, any wisdom dealing with I mean, I think just we need to hold this idea that we're a big tent. We're not going to get everything we want. We have to think of ourselves again as like a big family. This one wants a pony, that one wants to, go to the beach on Sunday. We're not all going to get everything we want, but you figure out some common core values, and then you have to make some strategic decisions. It's chess. Just remember you're playing chess because they're playing it and they've been playing it for a long time. Any wisdom dealing with apathy? It's a big part of our current electoral problems by design. Thank you so much for saying that. It was Steve Bannon who said, we're going to flood the zone with, and he used the word SHIT, said, we're going to flood the zone. And the idea is that sort of campaign of shock and awe. It's designed to make people feel apathetic. If you feel apathetic, that's what they want. I heard Steve Bannon speak at Charlie Kirk's America Fest right after the election. They had already won, but this was the angriest group of winners I had ever seen. Steve Bannon gets up there in his multiple shirts, looking like sort of just rolled out of a homeless camp or something, although he probably just got off his friend's billion-dollar yacht, right? He gets up there. He says, you guys didn't crawl in, when we lost in 2020, you guys didn't crawl into bed and suck your thumbs. You got out there and you decided to fight and see what we did. He's absolutely right. Now, they did things we would never want to do. They spread lies and disinformation. They inspired and organized political violence. We would never want to do those things. But they also turned out their base. They went after low propensity voters. There was a guy there who's talking about how, hey, we went after the Amish. Nobody ever did that. We turned out the Amish on our side in Pennsylvania. So it's really important to turn out the base and to go after people who are either low propensity voters or frankly don't know how to vote. I mean, it's confusing. If you've never voted, there might be people on this call who've never voted. I'm with you. Honestly, it's not like I registered to vote when I was 18 years old. It was really confusing to figure out, and I was sort of embarrassed that I couldn't do it. So I kind of let it go for a little bit. But there's no shame in asking someone for help. There's no shame in approaching your circle of friends and saying, hey, do any of you guys need, I have like a voter registration thing that I'm doing. Does anybody want to register? I'd love to help you get it done. So that's a really great way to get involved. Getting, a circle together, getting everybody registered, and then helping them understand the issues that really matter to them. I think when you're talking to people sometimes about voting, it's almost better to listen more than to talk because we all have concerns and our concerns are legitimate, so that could be really helpful. But we should note their strategic resolve because that's how they won. And if we can have that strategic resolve, I believe that those of us who would like to not just restore our democracy, but actually improve the system, we can win as well. Okay, thank you. Okay, Professor Walter Hill. I don't see why the technical people oppose science. What are they thinking? Um, hey, I cover a lot of this in my book, so I love you to read that. And I've also written about the war on science on a couple of my pieces. If you reach out to me, I'll send those to you. Um, uh, right. Why Jewish organizations? It's interesting. American Jews voted, I think it was 70% for Harris. 88% of Jewish women voted, maybe it was higher. 88% of Jewish women voted for Harris, and large numbers, and I think a large number of Jewish men voted for Harris as well. People are upset about it within those organizations, but maybe those press releases or those voices just aren't circulated in the same way. But I've certainly seen it in some of the like Jewish democratic organizations. And when you say that what the current administration is doing could backfire, it's already backfiring. It's like, I think, there's just a lot of, anti-Semitism is always somewhere, right? Just like racism to various kinds is always somewhere, but we're seeing a lot of those voices amplified. A lot of racism amplified too, a lot of anti-Black racism, anti-Latino racism. Oh my gosh. I mean, didn't the Supreme Court just rule that it's okay to racially profile or something like that? I've got to read up on that. I think that just happened last day or two. Another question, do you feel that throughout our history, an underlying considerable percent of citizens exist who are Democrats in name only? I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Um, I don't really know I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question. I apologize. How do you accept, I think the MAGA reason we have the blossoming of MAGA is in my book. Money lies in God. Huge amounts of money, billions of dollars over decades, have been devoted to this organizational infrastructure of an anti-democratic movement. Lies and disinformation is a huge part of the movement. It's a leadership-driven movement and it's organization-driven. And a lot of the funders of the movement have invested a lot of money in propaganda operations that have separated a lot of Americans from the facts, and that makes them easier to control. And third, God, because I would say religious nationalism or Christian nationalism is the most important sort of ideological feature of that mobilizes the largest part of this movement. It's how they mobilize the rank and file. If you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So for many years, it was abortion. If you get people to be pro-life voters, vote simple yes or no on anti-abortion, what they call defense of the family, which is an attack on marriage equality or anything that they see as pro-family, you can control their vote. You can get them to ignore the corruption, the degradation of our unions, the degradation of our of rights for the workforce, the fact that so much money is going up to the very top, et cetera. Now, the interesting thing about the pro-family agenda is that this movement is driving support for politicians whose policies are actually making it harder for American families to succeed. So a lot of that sort of pro-family talk was just very hollow. Um, how do we, if we play only defense, we will fail. How do we go on the offense? One thing that I've noticed in my years of attending right-wing conferences is they totally demonize, I mean, literally demonize the opposition. They call Democratic initiatives satanic in some places, or they say that everyone who doesn't agree with them is a communist or a socialist or a satanic, whatever. Um, which is, not everybody who disagrees with MAGA is a communist or a socialist, you know? They say that anyone who disagrees with them is against Christianity. This is not true. There are a lot of progressive Christians out there who are against the MAGA agenda, and they call those Christians woke Christians. They are so contemptuous toward those Christians who do not sort of totally exploit their faith for MAGA politics. But one thing I've also noticed in these right-wing spaces, that they articulate a positive vision of America and a positive vision of the future. ladders to climb for people who choose to climb them. And I think that is really important. People don't want to just act in fear. That is important. People need to be told the truth of what's happening. It's true. All of these anti-democratic moves are eroding our rights. They're eroding our institutions. They're eroding the safety of our money. All these needless tariffs. I mean, have you guys been to the grocery store lately? Have you tried to like buy anything? Those prices are not going down. But at the same time, we need to be able to articulate a positive vision of our country. Look, the principles of American democracy, the principles of equality, the idea that our laws should be deliberated in public through processes that the public is able to engage in, public officials that are accountable to the public, that laws should apply to everyone equally, including those in power. These are really the principles of pluralism, the principles of justice. These are beautiful ideals. They've not been implemented perfectly by any means throughout our history, but we've also seen a lot of progressive movements. There have always been reactionary elements in a country as big and complicated as ours, but we've also seen a number of very progressive movements. We've seen, the end of slavery and then movements toward greater civil rights. We've seen movements towards women's equality, LGBT equality. We've seen greater rights for the workforce. We're not supposed to have sweatshops anymore. I mean, in our country, we're supposed to have a certain kind of minimum wage that doesn't sustain an American family anymore. But the ideal of wages that can actually sustain a family are beautiful ideals, the ideals of a kind of fairness. These are great principles to speak to and to speak to other people about. And the idea that we can work toward a more perfect union is really critical. And I think it's important to articulate these ideals in that space. So thank you so much for that question. Who do I see as a possible leader? You know, there are a number of really fantastic people coming up in different places, doing different things that, I wouldn't put my money on any single one of them. And no doubt there are people that we haven't heard of yet. I think the Republican Party has done an incredible job of nurturing talent. They have these leadership training initiatives. They get people engaged at the local level through stuff like Moms for Liberty, and then they prepare them to run for local office and then state offices and then national. I mean, they're just, I think they've frankly done a better job of nurturing talent, nurturing young talent for sure. But it doesn't mean that there isn't talent on the other side. I continue to believe that more Americans would prefer to live in a democracy than a kleptocratic theocracy, a kleptocratic, autocratic theocracy with absolute suppression of free speech and uh, and suppression of political opposition, which is what authoritarianism is. So I think to be able to find leaders who can speak to that majority, get them mobilized to vote is really important. Bring Muslim voters back into the fold. That's a kind of like a 1% or 1.5% of the voting public, I think. And I think that any religious minority group, whether they're Muslim or whether they're Hindu or whether they're Sikh or Jewish or Buddhist or whatever, Jain, whatever, need to understand that if you're living in a theocracy, a Christian theocracy, which is what this MAGA movement would like to bring about, that's not going to be, it's not going to help them. The separation of church and state is not just a sort of, I would say, it's not just a kind of pie in the sky ideal. It's not just a theoretical concept. It's actually a concept that has been responsible not just for our democracy, but also our religious freedom. We have a mosaic of religions in our country where everyone is supposed to be equal, no matter what their religion is. And you don't get that unless you have the separation of church and state. And maybe helping people understand that is, if they're members of religious minority groups, is really important. I want to thank you for your questions. I think we've got maybe 5 minutes left. So I'm wondering if there are any more questions. Let me just, oh, there's a bunch. No, there's not. Can you see any more questions, Sean?
I do not see any more questions. Doesn't mean there aren't any, excuse me. So if anyone else has any questions, I know in the chat box earlier I encouraged students to speak up first in the Q&A so we could prioritize some students. If there's anybody who held back their questions as a result, that was a good time to ask them. We have Catherine here probably once with us this semester. And yeah, hopefully we'll be lucky to have her again, but limited time here to ask your questions. So now's the time to do so.
Well, I just want to say one last thing about that last question. I think people sort of hostility to immigrants, the kind of nativism and racism, naked racism that we're seeing in our coming out of this current administration will be a should be a powerful motivator for members of religious minority groups, for anyone who feels like they're not part of, that sort of ideal MAGA, definition of homeland, which is absurd. You know what's funny is the State Department and I think the Department of Homeland Security have tweeted out messages like, if your grandparents lived here and if your grandparents came over, you're truly American, right? If you've been here more than 2 generations or something. Well, you know who's been here more than 2 generations is a lot of Black Americans have ancestors that long predate the waves of immigration that included J.D. Vance's relatives. Are they more American than J.D. Vance? Would J.D. Vance say that his wife, whose parents were immigrants, is not truly American because she is, in fact, I think, like, relative, her people were relative newcomers to this country. It's really appalling, that idea of what an American is. And I think that kind of nativism and racism will also speak to Muslim Americans and also Americans of many other religious minority groups. It should speak to everyone, regardless of whether you're a member of a minority group or not. It's appalling. So,
I have one quick question for you. I don't have the opportunity to chat it in the chat box, but you're from here in California. You've seen some of, maybe Gavin Newsom's attempts, many great attempts at combating some of these things, but I can't remember the exact quote, but essentially was talking about fighting fire with the messaging stuff, like some of the memes and things that may come off as insulting, right? The idea that we don't need to, as Michelle Obama said, they go low, we go high. We need to actually, like, when they go low, let's kick them while they're on the ground. What do you feel about that?
one thing I've noted is that when people laugh, they're not afraid anymore. And Trump understood that. So in advance of the 2016 election, I was doing a piece for the Washington Post and interviewing a lot of people, younger people, to see who they were voting for and why. And a lot of people were like, he's funny. I just kind of want to see what he does. They just didn't really understand the policies necessarily, but they thought he was very amusing and they wanted to watch the show. And that brought a lot of people along. And, I can't speak, for or against Newsom, but one thing that he is doing with that use of humor is bringing a lot of people along because he's doing it in a way I wouldn't say it's kicking at all. It's like we think this is hilarious and we're making fun of you and we're all in on the joke. So I think that is a kind of tactic that could be effective and could bring a lot of people along. And also, like, I mean, the whole, dictator cosplay, it is silly. It is funny, and it should be made fun of. It's serious, seriously problematic, but it's also absurd. It reminds me of Charlie Chaplin, who made that film, The Great Dictator. If you guys haven't seen it, he was making fun of Hitler. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it because it was a fantastic movie, a spectacular movie. And I can't say that it directly led to the defeat of Hitler, but it definitely bolstered people's, I would say, determination to do so.
All right. Well, we want to be respectful of Catherine's time. It's time for us to go today, but everyone, thank you so much out there for joining us here in the conversation. And Catherine does welcome you to visit her website at catherinestewart.me to forward any other questions that you may have. And please go out and buy that book. Support great authors, great thinkers in this space. And until next time, Catherine, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you guys today.
Okie dokie, signing out.